Well, what do we say? Get started. It's going to be recorded, and people will, I'm sure, continue to file in until the room is packed.
Elbow room, standing room only.
Cool. Andrew, are you ready to go?
Yes, all set.
Welcome everybody to the May 12th Celsius Society seminar. Today, I'm super excited to be talking about water with Kris Stepenuck and Asim Zia, both colleagues within CALS, and the theme again will be water. I did want to talk briefly a little bit of background about the Celsius Society seminar. Again, these exist to provide a cross-pollinating forum for sharing research, education, and extension across CALS, hopefully across UVM and into the community as well. Our goals are to really try to support pollination, collaboration, problem solving with colleagues, weave a stronger network of relationships and professional connections throughout CALS and the university, and ultimately yield some large, innovative, integrated, and multidiscipline grant proposals. This is really a two-part thing. It's Celsius Society seminars and out-of-the-box brainstorming sessions. Our current organizing team is myself, Chris Callahan, Hans Estrin, and Andrew May, and we've had great support from other folks along the way. Always welcome new people to help in organizing these sessions, and always welcome your ideas at go.uvm.edu/Celsius Society seminar. As I mentioned, this is sort of a two-part thing. We have the seminars, which really focus on what we've done or what we're doing. We'll hear from two wonderful colleagues today talking about what they're doing and what they've done. And then the quarterly brainstorm sessions are really about what's next. What other questions could we be focusing on? What other work could we be doing? A little bit of background. We've been doing this a little over a year and have had 6 Celsius Society seminar sessions. Today is the 7th. We've had 148 people attend, which is great. And the out-of-box brainstorm sessions we've had 3 of with 100 attendees. Again, this is all about meeting new people, learning new things, and hatching some new plans, hopefully. Got a full year scheduled, which is wonderful. And today's topic again is water. In June, we'll be talking about human behavior. And then we're back to a brainstorming session, out of the box brainstorming session. And you can see the other topics we're working on there and pulling speakers together for, again, welcome ideas for themes and topics and speakers, and you can even self-nominate if you want. So go.uvm.edu/cells-to-society ideas. You can always catch recorded versions of the seminars on the Celsius Society website and on our YouTube channel. With that, I am going to turn it over to Kris Stepenuck, and we're reversing the order here slightly because we're going to be getting a PowerPoint email from Asim, who is out of the country and has kind of low bandwidth internet, so we want to make sure we can share the slides well with you all. Kris, feel free to take over the share, introduce yourself, and take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. My name is Kris Stepenuck. I use she and her pronouns, and I am an extension associate professor, as the slide said. My home base is in the Rubenstein School, but I have a split appointment with CALS X, and so I'm happy to be here today to talk about the work that I do, and I will share my screen. I'm going to share this one. I'm going to move this. We'll see if this works. Right now you're seeing nothing, but let me do it like this. In theory, now you're probably seeing this. You're not seeing the right thing, I think.
Yep.
Hold on. You were not seeing the
center mode. So if you do that again, you can just click swap. Yeah.
Oh, can I do that? I was going to do here. I'm just going to show you the other screen. Let me show you. You're going to look at that for a second, and now I'm going to put it back. Sorry. And how about that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Here we go. So wanted to think about how the public is contributing to protecting or improving water quality in the Lake Champlain Basin. And the reason for that is because the work that I do is with a program called Lake Champlain Sea Grant. And that program is funded by NOAA with partnership of universities. In our case, it's the University of Vermont and SUNY Plattsburgh. We are one of 34 Sea Grant programs in the country, and this map that's shown here is denoting where those are located. So there are many on ocean coasts, but there are also Sea Grant programs in all of the Great Lakes states and us, the blue dot up there in New England. And our mission is to develop and share science-based information that benefits both the environment and the economies of the Lake Champlain Basin. So the work that I'm sharing here in the twist or the bent of what I'll be sharing about what the public is doing all relates back to work of our Lake Champlain Sea Grant program, which has about a dozen staff who are doing outreach and extension work throughout the Lake Champlain Basin. So as you all know, there are a variety of stressors that Lake Champlain faces, everything from flooding and the impacts both economically as well as environmentally to stormwater runoff, bringing in nutrients to Lake Champlain that then feed cyanobacteria blooms. There's also the emerging contaminants, one of which is microplastics, and trying to understand what those look like within the lake, within the food chain. And the next question is, what is that doing to our health or to the health of the aquatic life? There's also invasive species and thinking about how that impacts the lake economically as well as environmentally. And another example is overuse of salt in winter. So these are just a smattering of the kinds of topics that our Lake Champlain Sea Grant staff are thinking about. So one thing I'm not sure if people know is that the Lake Champlain watershed, the drainage area that comes into Lake Champlain, is very, very large in comparison to the lake itself. The ratio is about 19:1. And if you were to look at the Great Lakes watersheds, shown here in the various colors, the watershed drainage area for each lake is a unique color: the orange, the green, the pink, the purple, and the kind of brownish. What we know is that the watershed to land ratio in those watersheds is really small compared to what Lake Champlain's is. So it's 1.5 or 2 to 1 for each of those lakes. So that message then is that what happens on the land here in the Lake Champlain watershed really impacts water quality. And so we try in our outreach programming to carry on a message that's called the all-in approach. That was something that the state of Vermont came up with back in the kind of the mid 2010s to recognize that there's something that everybody can do to benefit or to protect water quality. And whether that be thinking around stormwater and implementing green stormwater practices that help to reduce stormwater runoff, or whether that's thinking about an audience of professionals who are managing road salt and minimizing the amount of road salt so that we can minimize the amount of chloride that's entering surface or groundwaters, to marinas and engaging with marinas as well as recreational boaters around best practices to protect the lake's health from fuel spills, from trash, from paints, from other kind of contaminants that could come from boaters, which I will talk about more. So the different circles that are shown here are, I will dig in a little bit deeper to some of them, but it is basically a smattering of the kinds of things that our Lake Champlain Sea Grant program is doing. So some of which I've already mentioned, and some of which I will mention in more detail as we go. So starting with road salt, one of the things that we're doing, again, with both municipal audiences as well as private contractors, in thinking about what actions these folks are taking to lower their use of salt during winter, and specifically chloride-based deicers, or what are called anti-icers. So when you are using a chloride-based product before a storm to help reduce the bond between ice and the pavement surface. We want people to use less of that so that there are fewer impacts on the environment and on infrastructure, since salt and chloride degrade things like concrete and facades of buildings and bridges etc. So some of the things that we're doing are offering trainings to these professionals to understand best practices. And that's, again, at multiple levels. So this picture is showing the contractors how to calibrate a large plow truck so that they can know how much salt is going out at different settings of within the cab. And we've created videos with 2 different municipalities as well as with a private contractor to show the different kinds of equipment and how people, as one of the videos says, if you know how much is going out, you can improve how much is being put into the environment. We've also developed some online calculators for the crews to use, knowing that they are sometimes up for 24, 48, 72 hours at a time, and making it easier for them to have a recommendation of how much salt they should put down based on having calibrated their equipment, and then getting a recommendation for how not to use as much, but still to protect the public. And so some of the outcomes here and things that the public, and I'm calling these audiences in terms of the municipal staff or the private contractors, members of the public as a target audience. So an example, we did 2 trainings one fall and did a follow-up evaluation 7 months later. And we learned that 6 individuals had used new technologies to improve their snow removal processes. One community was calibrating more frequently. One community was using advanced weather forecasting to inform what they were doing and the kind of product they were putting down. 4 communities were tracking salt use. 3 had pledged to reduce their salt use. 4 communities had reduced the amount of materials or salt applied, and 3 had trained employees in best practices. And we also know specifics. Some had added cameras to inform being able to know what was happening at a certain corner or a certain intersection to be able to then adjust their materials that they were putting down. One group had changed over to using a spreader that had the ability to adjust how much they were putting down. And these groups reported saving money, saving time, and they felt like they'd increased their credibility. And we know that their practices were being implemented across 972 lane miles. Continuing on the theme of road salt, at the University of Vermont, the Salt Reduction Task Force has been formed. And the reason for this is that the UVM was recognizing that there was a lot of damage being done to campus buildings. On the far left here, this is in the Davis Circle. One of the vaults underneath the Davis Circle was literally accumulating these stalactites coming down from the surface of salt, and that's degrading away the stairs that were in there, or the ladder, and as well as accumulating on the machinery that's underneath the surface. And we also know that there's facades on buildings, or the fronts, stairways being degraded, internal entryways being impacted to the tune of $1.7 million in replacements of failed systems over 5 years. And so UVM's motivation for wanting to reduce salt was initially based on infrastructure damage, and they also recognized that there was environmental impacts. And so this task force formed, and in the past year and a half, the UVM has started to use new equipment that has the ability to measure how much salt is being put out. They're using liquid brine. So the picture here is showing, again, anti-icing. So putting down this liquid brine that can use 50% less salt and prevent the bond of snow and ice when the storm does come. So that helps to be able to make a cleaner surface and use less salt after the storm. The UVM is also engaging in custodian training to talk about outside those entry areas, what are the best practices for reducing salt there, utilizing all of the contractors that are working with campus to augment the staffing are required to have a certain certification, and we ran that training for them last fall. There's also students and faculty who are working on stormwater pond monitoring to assess what's going on campus in terms of runoff and what's the environmental impact, as well as nearby streams being monitored to assess that impact. And then there's some alternative solutions being researched in collaboration with various faculty members, as well as some businesses who have made donations of electric mats. There was a student group that looked at waste reverse osmosis water this semester to see if that could potentially be used as a brine, which the answer is it can't. It's not concentrated enough. But and then also looking next semester at heating concrete and seeing what the energy use is and the durability of that. So super cool things happening on this campus. But also individuals have the opportunity to act as well. And so some just basic information that we're sharing through videos and through general outreach programs, press releases, etc., is that people can, apparently that one was a timed one, people can measure, always shovel first, clear that surface, use 3 inches of spacing between the salt grains, cleaning up leftover salt afterwards so that it doesn't run off into the environment, and using, if it's sodium chloride, only at pavement temperatures above 15, because it doesn't work after that. And I was involved with some colleagues from CALS and the Lake Champlain Committee with funding from the Lake Champlain Basin program to survey across the Lake Champlain Basin last fall what people are doing for stewardship actions. And so we know that from this survey, we had about 1,600 people reply to the survey, and we have enough responses from New York, Quebec, and Vermont to be able to analyze those locales separately. So we know that more than half of people on average, 55%, always limit their use of salt on driveways and sidewalk in the winter. And you can see the differences between Quebec, Vermont, and New York, where there's slightly higher compliance within Quebec and slightly lower within New York, and Vermont's squarely in the middle. We also offer clean boating educational materials for recreational boaters, and there's a variety of things that are happening within that program. We have signs that we deliver to marinas about keeping fuel out of the water, keeping the lake free from waste materials running off if somebody's cleaning their boat or painting their boat or trash. We also sponsor, and we have all of the sewage pump out facilities on the lake in an app called the Pump Out Nav app. And so that helps boaters know when and where to find pump out systems, and to be able to know the hours of operation, the costs, and the location from their own location on the lake. And we also have monofilament fishing line recycling stations at various marinas and aquatic. We share information from the Lake Champlain Basin program about minimizing the spread of aquatic invasive species. And from the survey that we did, that I just mentioned before, we know that about 2/3 of watercraft users in the Lake Champlain Basin are always doing the recommended thing, which is to clean, drain, and dry their boats to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So pretty good response there. A different project that we're working with a variety of partners on to sponsor, as well as to engage people in practice, is related to stormwater. And it is a project we call Raise the Blade. So it has to do with raising lawnmower blades to 3 inches, and then allowing the clippings of when the lawn is cut to decompose in place, and to only cut about 1/3 of the length of the blade and anyone cutting, and that protects the health of the grass. The idea is that we are helping to promote root growth and to add soil organic matter to the soil. And those two things will allow more stormwater infiltration and more water to be held within the soil, and to therefore reduce stormwater runoff and protect the local waterways from nutrient impacts. And so we have 10 businesses that are on board with doing this, and 6 communities within the Lake Champlain Basin that have adopted these practices. We also did ask this question in that basin-wide survey, and on average, about just over half of people are always raising their lawnmower blades to 3 inches. So we feel good about that. Moving on to a different topic area, we know that groups and individuals are planting trees and shrubs, often native plants, along shorelines to help prevent erosion, to provide habitat, and to have those utilize nutrients for their growth and to help stabilize the bank. In the survey that we did, we know that a very high percent of people are reporting that they have planted or allowed vegetation to grow alongside a waterway, or they've reduced the size of their lawn. So about 63% overall have who do have a vegetation or a waterway within their property are allowing that to be planted with vegetation, and then about half of people on average are allowing their lawn to shrink or to be replaced with native plantings. We also asked about people's installation of rain gardens or rain barrels, nature-based solutions that help the stormwater sink in, slow down. And we know about a third of people in Vermont, I specifically pulled that one out, have installed rain barrels or rain gardens who have lawns areas or rooftops that they can use that on to minimize stormwater runoff. I also wanted to mention that we have a new rain garden manual for Vermont and the Lake Champlain Basin that helps to provide guidance to homeowners about installing or developing rain gardens, and that's available as a PDF, or we have printed copies through Lake Champlain Sea Grant. People are also taking action in terms of looking at local water quality and kind of understanding what's going on. How clean is the water in their local area? This happens through school groups, through the Watershed Alliance program, which is sponsored by Extension, Lake Champlain Sea Grant, and the Lake Champlain Basin program. And there's also the Vermont Lay Monitoring Program, which has about 100 volunteers looking at water quality in inland lakes, and a couple dozen volunteers on Lake Champlain. So about a quarter of people reported having at some point monitored water quality in the basin. A little bit of a different approach. We're also working with beach managers around Lake Champlain to develop common signage that is trying to be less reliant upon English and more reliant upon images and graphics that represent what we want people to know, to try to reach audiences who have English as a second language or who happen to not be English readers. And we know from a survey in 2018 from the Vermont Department of Public Health that only about a third of Vermonters could recognize what a harmful algal bloom or a cyanobacteria bloom looks like. So the idea is that we want people to understand what these look like. We want them to understand the health risks to them, to their families, to their pets, and other animals, and to be able to avoid making contact with water if there is a bloom present. And then moving into a different survey, not the basin-wide survey that we just did, but one of our teachers who have participated in Watershed Alliance, this K-12 education program that also involves teacher education. And that program has been going on since about 2001, and it engages school groups in monitoring local stream health. It also offers the opportunity for school groups to go out on Lake Champlain on the research vessel to monitor the health of the lake or to assess water clarity and other parameters. And within that, as I mentioned, we try to follow this all-in approach. And so we share for everything. We kind of talk about the health of the lake and what's going on and what people can do in their own personal lives to take action to benefit, to protect the lake or to improve water quality. And we specifically asked teachers a couple of years ago who had participated in the program, what are you personally doing as a result of what you've learned in this program? And the number one thing that they said, and it was about just under a third of the teachers said, I have personally started to reduce use of single-use plastic. And so some of the things that we suggest to people are bringing their own bags, saying no to straws, using things that have plastic-free wrappings. And then one of the things we know from some microplastic research on the lake is that the wastewater treatment plants are allowing microplastics to go into the lake And so having people reduce washing of their fleece or other synthetic materials can reduce the amount of microplastics entering the lake. And so just to show you the graphic here for their responses, that reducing single-use plastics was, again, the #1 thing the teachers were reporting, but there are a number of other things that I've mentioned today that the teachers also mentioned, where they're reducing salt or they're following recommended lawn care practices. And it kind of makes sense. The things that are higher energy of activation are lower percent people are doing those things. And then just in wrapping up here, we know from that survey across the basin that the distance people live to the lake matter in how much they're thinking about water quality and what they're doing in terms of stewardship and their education. So the people who knew, we asked them, do you know what a watershed is? The people who knew what a watershed was are much more likely to engage in stewardship activities than those who didn't know what a watershed was. So we just use that as a measure of knowledge. And we know that about half of people said that they've talked to others about what they can do to protect water quality. So one shameless plug that I would love to invite people to participate in, behavior change campaigns need to be targeted to specific audiences. That's one thing we know, right, from, where do they live and what do they know and what are they doing. So there is a community-based social marketing workshop happening online June 7, 8, and 9 at a very economic rate. You can get it's $100 for nonprofits, academics, state agencies, and you can get a 50% discount if you ask me for the code. So hopefully we can encourage some folks to participate in that. And that's all I have.
Kris, thanks so much. I'm always so impressed by how engaging the public outreach efforts that you do are with a really wide range of stakeholders. Thanks so much for that. So we'll do Q&A after Asim's together, because we'd like to explore the commonalities and differences together. Asim, are you still with us?
Hi.
There you are. Great. And I believe you are not just around the corner in Burlington. Do I have that right?
No, I am right now on a Fulbright program here in Jordan River Basin. Right now I am stationed with a U.S. State Department grant in Israel and Jordan and Palestinian territories.
Well, thank you so much.
This week I am in Amman, Jordan right now.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us from so far.
Well, thank you for the bandwidth. Yeah. So I have sent my presentation to Andrew, and I'm hoping that he can share it. And then I can probably request him to move it forward. Thank you. Okay, so this is a program that Highlands to Oceans and relationships in Transboundary river basins that we unveiled in the meeting in Glasgow. And this is a global initiative, and my current Fulbright project is also with that. And I've been working in perfect context for some of the work that on this particular project is building off of. So would you please move to the next slide? Okay, so recently, just before the COP26, World Met Organization released a report about global water stress hotspots. And you can see, like in the Western North America, for example, there are droughts are going to be happening. In part of my Fulbright project is also situated in Amazon Basin. So all these red dots that are shown, circles, those are the global hotspot stresses. And we're big focused in the, like, for example, Andean mountains. The glaciers are melting. So those are the Western South America. I was in Ecuador earlier on, and Peru earlier this year as part of this project. You also see in the middle, like the Middle East, that's where I'm right now situated, in the Jordan River Basin. There's also South Asia in this basin where I'll be going next year. But I've been engaged in a variety of these places where the global hotspots are, where the challenge is that if you look at the numbers down at the end of the slide, about in 2018, 2.3 billion people were living in the countries under water stress. And by 2050, we expect that about 5 billion people would have water stress at least one time per month, 1 month per year. So it's like a very challenging situation that we face globally in terms of the access and equitable access to water. But it's also not just about equitable access to water, it's also about water quality as I would mention that the water quality challenges with the climate change are going to be even worsening, even in places like Lake Champlain, as I'll show you later on in my slides. Would you please go to the next slide? So the World Met Organization recommended these to tackle these stresses. They said, well, we need to invest in integrated resources, water management as a solution to better manage water stress. We also need to invest in end-to-end drought and flood early warning, early action systems. We need to fill the capacity gap in terms of collecting ground level data sets and integrate data sets across different systems from satellites to ground sensors. We need to improve the interaction among these different stakeholders and engage them in terms of co-producing the knowledge and understanding, like how can different stakeholders address these challenges. All of these are great recommendations, but these recommendations assume that the transboundary riparian countries and transboundary river systems are willing to cooperate and coordinate with each other in implementing these efforts. So a lot of the focus of my project in the transboundary context is about building this cooperation, identifying scenarios and working on the ground with both in terms of a political track one diplomacy initiative, but also science diplomacy initiative, bringing together scientists from these different riparian countries to identify pieces, cooperative scenarios. So one of the challenges with these kind of recommendations that come from international or interagency working groups is that they ignore the imminent reality of water wars within and across riparian countries due to climate change. So for example, I'm here in Jordan Basin, where you might have been seeing in the newspapers the recent skirmishes between Israel and Palestine, but there are also Israel and Jordan are in conflict situation in Pakistan and India in the Indus Basin. And similarly in the Amazon system, the Ecuador and Colombia and Ecuador and Peru are having some challenges as with the climate change induced water scarcity. Next slide, please. So these are quickly some of these riparian countries that I wanted to show you. In the Indus Basin on the left-hand side, you see that the Indus Basin comes out of the Indus Tibetan Delta, which is the third pole, and climate change induced glacial melt in the Tibet, in the upper Himalaya region is already causing water scarcity challenges in the Indus Basin, especially in Pakistan, but also Afghanistan and Indian regions. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the Mekong River Basin we've been working on as well, where a lot of these dams are being built upstream by China and Myanmar, which is having challenges both in terms of availability and access to fisheries in the downstream countries like Vietnam. So just to give you the context, like these triangles shown in these maps are the dams, and you can compare the two systems, and you see that in the Mekong system, there are a lot more dams than in the Indus Basin. But in both cases, the dams are having an effect on ecology of the rivers, but as well as the livelihoods of the people in the downstream countries. Please, next slide, please. So in the next slide, on the left-hand side, you will see the Amazon River Basin, where the tropical deforestation is not only accelerating global climate change, but also the deforestation is also causing regional droughts in these systems. So the regional droughts are being felt, for example, if the tropical deforestation is in Brazil, the regional droughts are being felt in Ecuador and Peru, and that's why they are under water stress situations. A lot of the dams are, if you see in the Andean mountains on the left-hand side, are there, and even sponsored by Brazil and these bigger power countries in this region. On the right-hand side, the map you're seeing is from the Jordan River Basin. That's where I'm right now situated, just south of the Sea of Galilee that you see in the middle of the map between Israel and Jordan Basin. Actually, I was visiting a couple of project sites all day today and just got back 15 minutes before the meeting. And I just want to point out that water is at the core of the many conflicts in these countries that we're trying to work with. And if there are questions, we can discuss that. Move to the, please, the next slide. So at home, as Kris mentioned already, the drainage system in the Lake Champlain Basin, you see the Lake Champlain flows north. It's also like then drains into the Atlantic Ocean via, it is one of the smallest Great Lakes, if you will. And we've been working in this system as well in a variety of National Science Foundation funded projects. Next slide, please. Especially our focus here has been on the Missisquoi watershed, which is a transboundary watershed between US and Canada. And some of our work in the last 10 years have led to renewed calls for revising the International Joint Commission deals that have been set up between the U.S. and Canada, because in the context of climate change, we are experiencing more and more flooding, and that is bringing more nutrients and causing algal blooms, and the pollution caused by New York and Quebec and New York and Vermont is leading towards downstream effects in Quebec in terms of so there are like transboundary pollution challenges that have arisen between US and Canada due to the climate change issues. Next slide, please. So all of these systems that we are working on, there are these challenges of these cross-scale interactions in social ecological systems from theoretical standpoint. These mean that on this diagram, what I'm showing you is the log time in years and the log of space in the x-axis. So what's happening is that the climate change and these kind of like El Nino global scale patterns, which are like relatively slow turnover variables, they happen over decadal and centurial time scales. They're having an effect on very, very short term, like the phytoplankton populations in lakes, freshwater lakes, but they're also mediated by the human agency and the policies and the behaviors of the people in these systems. So these coupled systems that are having an effect, one of our goals in all of these projects is to understand how we can make interventions that account for these two-way feedbacks between social and ecological systems. Next slide, please. In social ecological systems, like one of the pioneering work that we have been doing is to build these computational models to assess the resilience in social ecological systems. Especially, we are interested in understanding that when exposed to these exogenous shocks like extreme events, droughts, floods, heat waves, cold snaps, or endogenous surprises. So for example, the ecological collapse in the case of fisheries, or the phytoplankton populations or algal blooms, do these social ecological systems, do they necessarily go through gradual change, or rather there are like critical transitions or tipping points or regime shifts that could cause these shifts, the cascading regime shifts that we call. So for example, if climate change is happening at the global scale and we have like a worst case scenario unfolding or the best case scenario, in both scenarios, it would have an effect on what happens in the freshwater lakes, but also how much water is available to the people in these large river basins for food security or energy access, and all these nexus issues between climate, food, water, energy are being modeled as part of these this framework. Next slide, please. So this is one of the questions, for example, that we are trying to, just as an example, in the modeling questions, we're looking at like how anticipation of these climate change induced extreme events coupled with anticipated impact of land use, land cover change on the water quality of freshwater lakes will lead to anticipatory and reflexive governance that induce proactive policy changes to mitigate nutrient pollution across Transboundary Lake Champlain Basin, for example. So on the x-axis of this diagram, you're seeing, like the global climate change can have RCP 2.6, which means the best case scenario, that's the Paris Treaty goal, or the worst case is RCP 8.5. So if just on the right side is like whether the state economy is contracting or expanding or it's in steady state. Then we have like the multi-level governance that's happening between federal government, state government, and the local governments, whether that's fragmented or coordinated. We are looking at the watershed land cover, whether we are like implementing all those good things that Kris talked about, like green infrastructure, we are conserving forests, we are conserving riparian areas, or we are doing like just cutting down the forest. There is agricultural expansion happening more in an industrial fashion, not necessarily agroecological or permaculture context, or it's similarly the watershed land use, how that is happening in terms of like whether people are adopting nutrient management practices or not, the watershed hydrology, whether it's highly connected or low connectivity. So in the end, the regime shifts in the lake, for example, whether the lake is oligotrophic or mesotrophic, like the good states, or the regimes of eutrophic or hypereutrophic regimes, which are the kind of perpetuate algal blooms year after year, decades after decades. So those regime shifts are happening under what scenarios in terms of from the local, state to federal to the global scenarios. So the red arrow on the top, for example, shows a scenario which is kind of like shows the non-resilient scenario. And at the same time, the green scenario shows an example of a resilient scenario. And this came out from our work with the stakeholders from all of these groups that I mentioned as part of a project. The point is that from the human cognition perspective, there are like about hundreds of thousands of scenarios that could be conceptualized or that could unfold and materialize because of the complexity of the system. So the computational models, we develop the computational models across all these systems and develop them to understand and work with the stakeholders to identify the resilient scenarios. And I'll show you some examples that the kind of work that we have done. So next slide, please. Just a slide about the anticipatory governance. The important point about understanding the anticipatory governance is that we anticipate the risk in the future. So we engage with the future, but we act in the present. And traditionally, like historically in 60s and 70s, the traditional quantitative risk analysis or cost benefit analysis kind of approaches were done. But more recently, like what you see in the purple in the middle, like the participatory approaches, engaging with the people, co-production of the knowledge, but also very reflective and critical perspective that is needed for changing the paradigm of the existing policies and changing the behaviors, as Kris mentioned, like behavioral change communication. So a lot of those aspects are part of the anticipatory governance. So we anticipate the risks that are going to happen in the future, but we act in the future, in the present, both in terms of changing our behaviors, but also using the policy and governance system to change our behaviors. So that kind of those are the direct outcomes of these social ecological system computational models that we're working with the different stakeholders in these systems. Next slide, please. So this is an example of an integrated assessment model that we have built where we have been able to integrate the regional climate models. So there are like about 22 global climate models that we downscale to the Lake Champlain Basin under this project. We have also been able to develop an agent-based model that simulates land use, land cover change at 30-meter resolution for the entire Missisquoi River Basin. We've also been able to integrate these models with the hydrological and biogeochemical models and couple them with the lake models. And there have been a lot of papers been published, but just 2 weeks ago, on the bottom right, you see the paper that came out in Earth's Future in 2 weeks ago. And I'm putting down in the chat the link to this paper that is open science, and you can download it, and that provides a lot of background information about this model. There are also links to the previous papers that we published in this space. But in this paper, basically what we found was that the climate change legacy phosphorus synergy hinders lake response to aggressive water policy targets. So for example, in Missisquoi, under the latest Clean Water Act mandated total maximum daily load reductions, EPA has mandated that 64.3% reductions must be taken in the phosphorus from entering from the Missisquoi River into the Missisquoi Bay. But we found was that even if we implement those 64.3% reductions, the algal bloom are not going to go down. So the EPA need to change its policy from targeting water quality standards in nutrient concentrations to more like tracking the ecological indicators like algal blooms and all of that. So I think these are the kind of like the direct findings where our work is leading to informing the national level policies, but also our paper project has implications for the European policy, like how we can mandate and mitigate water quality under climate change scenarios and how we can inform the policy development in this space. Next slide, please. So the model basically can compute, it kind of like runs on a daily time scale, sometimes an hourly time scale. But this is just an example of a scenario where the figure A shows downscale climate change scenario RCP 8.5 in a day in August in 2040. This is like a scenario. I'm just showing you the different configurations of this scenario, and we have an agricultural intensification of the land use in Missisquoi watershed in the figure B on the right side, top right, and in the figure C shows the hydrological scenario where the evaporation and all of those factors because of the high heat change the water and hydrological system, the way water and nutrients flow through the system. And then please note the figure D, which is the projected chlorophyll density in the Missisquoi Bay, where the top right column where you see the red dots, those pixels show the algal bloom density that would be happening in the Canadian portion because of the agricultural expansion in the Vermont portion of this. Can we move to the next slide, please? So these are the kind of like the climate scenario projections that we're looking at. There is like an average temperature increase just in a short span of 30 years. We're looking at anywhere from, on the left-hand side, the delta temperature compared to the baseline, we're looking at from 2 to 6 degrees centigrade increase, which is because we're in the northern latitudes. So this must show you the challenges with climate change that we face, because the climate change is not only having direct effects on the waters, through warming the lake waters and the river waters, which creates more biological activity, but there are also indirect effects on the behaviors of the people who are, for example, with warming temperatures, the agricultural growing season is going to be expanding in Vermont. Vermont is becoming like Virginia. So that would mean more nutrients going into the systems. There's also on the right-hand side, we are projecting that the amount of precip under all these climate models is going to be increasing. It's not going to be decreasing. There are some intra-annual droughts that might happen, but more or less we are looking at more precip in this system. Next slide, please. These are, like I already mentioned, the agent-based model can simulate not only agricultural expansion, but also more different scenarios. We worked with the stakeholders to design these scenarios like forest conservation, pro-development, like more migration of people from, say, a drought-ridden southwestern US into Northeast. That is a possibility because the southwestern US is already experiencing mega droughts and people are starting to migrate towards Northeast or Northwest or Southeast. Similarly, there are like pro-forest conservation scenarios that we can also simulate for about 100 years under this model. Next scenario, next slide, please. So this is from the paper in the Earth's Future. It's rather complex slide, but the right hand shows that the TP reduction scenarios that include 64.3% reduction scenarios, but we also simulated what if you do like 0% reduction versus if you do like 100% reduction starting from 2021. And we simulated this for about 50 years. And what we basically, I mentioned earlier on, what we find is that even with 64.3% reduction scenarios, the TP concentration targets that EPA set will not be met. And the chlorophyll targets or the algal bloom targets would not even be met by 2050 under very, very aggressive scenarios, like even like 80%, 90% reduction is not going to lead to cleanup because of the climate change offsetting effects. Next slide, please. So this is like we can also use the model can simulate like early action versus delayed action. We can work with the stakeholders to identify exactly how much action you're going to take in terms of reducing nutrients, as well as when would you do it. And we can then identify under which scenarios. For example, on the right-hand side, the blue lines show the scenarios where the lake would be more eutrophic versus hyper-eutrophic. Under no scenario, we see that the system becomes mesotrophic or clean. Next slide, please. So we are expanding this similar model as part of my work right now with the U.S. State Department grant is to work with the stakeholders and expand this work in the Indus, Mekong, and Jordan River basins, where we are bringing together scientists as well as policymakers to replicate this model in these large river systems, where we would be simulating climate change and El Nino, La Nina systems and glacial regime shifts, like whether glacials stay stable or degraded, what would be the hydroclimatic regimes in terms of the water quantity, whether they would be dry, normal, or wet, and then really whether the ecosystem services and in terms of the hydrological, ecological ecosystem services, whether hydropower, irrigation, fishing, drinking water, whether water is available or not, and whether the ecosystem service demand in terms of for the farmers, for energy producers, households is going to be met or not, and whether that would lead to migration or not. And like for example, you might know the example of Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Syria that happened because of the climate change-induced droughts. And you can imagine the scenarios that led from the migration of people from Syria. So these are the similar scenarios that we anticipate are unfolding in the Indus and in the and Amazon basins and Jordan River basins already. So we are trying to understand like what the national governments, subnational governments, and the transboundary systems can they cooperate, or would they stay in the conflict situation? So we are looking into working with the stakeholders to understand that can the water be allocated in some kind of equitable way. Next slide, please. As well as can we use these kind of models to set up anticipatory policies in these systems as opposed to reactive policies, and understand those and use this model as a boundary object to help the stakeholders develop transboundary cooperative mechanisms, but also national and subnational level policies that would provide access and water security for everybody in these systems in the face of the climate change, and minimize climate migration and provision and maximize the provision of ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the integrated assessment model that I already mentioned, but right now this is slightly because our model is very modular. It runs on a supercomputing cluster. So we can swap in and out different models, but this is the current configuration of the model that we're working on in the Indus Basin and the Jordan River Basin. There are some initial versions of the model that has been developed, and we've been made some presentations about it in the UN system. Next slide, please. So as part of this, we have also started a new initiative across these countries. Right now, this is called Transboundary Water in Cooperation Network. You can go to transboundarywater.org. There are about 20 plus country representatives of 60 organizations that are part of this network. And we are trying to work with them to implement these water security recommendations that are being implemented. Next slide, please. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just trying to wrap it up so we have some discussion time. So essentially, just to conclude, social ecological systems are characterized by cross-scale interactions, uncertainty in behavior across space and time, non-linearities, tipping points, and so forth. We need anticipatory governance in order to build resilience to climate change and land use change in social ecological systems that accounts for uncertainty, regime shifts, and lags and inertia. So these kind of computational models can be deployed as computational intelligence engines to anticipate and build stakeholder foresight. So these modeling opportunities these are not like prescriptions, rather they're aimed at building foresight of the stakeholders from the policymakers all the way to the citizens. So that's really the work that I'm doing, and we're trying to make the difference on the ground here. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussions and the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Asim. Appreciate it. Let's move right into questions for either Kris or Asim. Feel free to, I think we're a small enough group, feel free to just unmute. Go ahead, Roy. Or no, it looks like Scott, I'm sorry.
Thank you both. This might be more for Kris, but I'd be curious to hear both of you. Kris, you mentioned microplastics, and I feel like that's certainly an under appreciated concern in our waterways, and curious if there's a way to determine the source of the different microplastics, and if so, what those might be. Because my understanding is that a lot of products contain microplastics on purpose, and I don't know if it's that or the degradation of plastics in our environment, or both.
Yeah, good question. So it's actually, well, it's both. And we know from a research project that Dr. Danielle Garneau from SUNY Plattsburgh did a few years back that the primary type of microplastic in the lake is fibers. So that is coming from our clothing. And she did observe other kinds of microplastics. So it can either be, microplastics are small plastics that have either broken down or they're very small already. So what she was seeing as fibers is number one that is in Lake Champlain. She did see nurdles, which is like a pre-production plastic, just sort of round balls, but she is she has not figured out where that source could have been for those. But anyway, the most prevalent kind are fibers, so that's coming from our clothing.
Wild. Kris, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but I just wanted to quickly say we've been using the rain garden design manual with vegetable growers as an effluent management technique for vegetable water on farms. So oftentimes they don't have septic systems, they're not near municipal sewers, and it's water with soil in it. So the challenge is making sure code enforcement officers are on board, but more on that later.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, Leslie, welcome.
Hi. So, Kris, unfortunately, I missed most of your talk. I had a conflict, but I jumped in as soon as I could. And so I guess my question is directed towards Asim. So it was a little bit dismaying to hear that if we remove total phosphate or get it down to some low level, it's not going to make as much of a difference because of other climate changes. So what is a person to do? I mean, what would your recommendations be to and maybe I missed it, but if we can't do that, then what other steps that humans can reasonably take would work?
Yeah, so this
He's frozen on my screen.
was since the 19th century. Can you hear me?
I can't.
Keep going, Asim. Keep going.
Okay, so there are like legacy phosphorus in the Mississippi Basin that is since 19th century. So these are the long-term nutrients that reside at the bottom of the bay. So the climate change-induced warming is basically leading to the release of the nutrients from the sediments of the bay. So that is one factor. The other factor is, so we are paying our current generation is paying the price for the actions of the 100 years of generations in the past. But at the same time, I think that we need to learn a lesson from this, that the climate change is not only going to be happening and having an effect on the Arctic, or it's going to have an effect on the people in Bangladesh. Climate change is having an effect in our backyard. And I think for us, it is very, very critical that we take action at the global scale to mitigate the climate change. Under best case climate change scenarios, we can save the bigger Lake Champlain. But maybe the shallow bays might not be saved, like Mississippi Bay is a shallow bay. But I think the deeper systems, deeper lakes, so we need to take a collective action at the global scale and not just excuse ourselves that like other people need to take the action and our responsibility is not to take the action at the global scale. I think our best bet is to make sure that we meet the 1.5 degree centigrade goal at the global scale. That is the best way that we can save this. And under those scenarios, we might have hope of minimizing the algal bloom, like from hyper-eutrophic to more eutrophic, and then eventually over 100-year time frame, we might be able to bring them back to the mesotrophic states. So I think like that the point is that we need to take the action, even though we are like situated in US, and not just think about that it's a responsibility of people in Bangladesh or Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you, of course.
We're running a little bit over, but I'm not going to cut the conversation short. We should keep going a little bit. If you need to leave, please do so. I apologize, but let's keep going. Roy?
Yeah, I thought these are wonderful presentations. Thanks to both Asim and Kris. And I have questions for both of you. I have a bunch of questions, but I just will ask one because I want to be respectful of the time, regardless of what Kris just said. So Asim, I was bowled over when you mentioned, did you say that increase in agricultural activity in Vermont will have an impact on lake impediments? Well, basically impairment on the Canadian side of the lake. What is that? How does that impact on, what are the political ramifications of that? As relates to the whole issue of climate change and the conversations internationally. And if you hold your answer 1 second, please. Kris, I'm interested in finding out what the acreage of mowable lawns are within the basin and how that impacts education and prevention of issues in the lake. So if you could just both jump into that, I'd appreciate it.
Asim, you want to go first?
Sure, I can try that. So, Roy, this is a great question, and when we published the first paper in environmental research letters about 5 years ago, that created a lot of controversy. And now with this paper, we have like reconfirmed our findings in a more elaborate set of scenarios. The challenge here is that there was a very cooperative mechanism between US and Canada, and under an International Joint Commission in 1990s, they set up a mechanism that would lead to the allocation of the burden for reducing phosphorus pollution in the Mississippi Basin differentially between US, like New York and Vermont and the Quebec parts. So that formula was settled and then renegotiated in the 2015 TMDL agreement. And actually in the Earth's Future paper, we have devoted about a page and a half towards discussing these political challenges in this context. This research has led to the Canadian side now wants to redo that agreement because they feel that under the climate change, there would be more phosphorus nutrients coming from the Vermont side. So they want to make sure that either the flood control happens or so that the water runoff does not happen, or they're even considering scenarios of like putting up dams in the ways that the Lake Champlain goes into, so that the nutrients do not flow and the poor water quality does not affect their systems. That scenario is actually going to be causing more problems for Vermont, because if Quebec puts up a dam, that would raise the water levels in the Lake Champlain and cause flooding in the Lake Champlain areas. So I think like we need to figure out a cooperative mechanism, not only for the Mississippi Bay, but for the entire lake. Right now we just got a NOAA grant to understand as part of the new National Water Center project with the University of Alabama to expand our study to the entire lake in the next 5 years and configure these scenarios, like how much these allocations under different allocation scenarios, what would be the impacts on the downstream countries like Canada. So I think like this is going to be a long-term process of renegotiating these burden allocations. But that's the reality that we are living in right now. Kris, please.
Yeah, so your question, Roy, is a question that I have been asking, and I've been trying to get the answer by working with student employees to do some GIS analysis, and I have yet to find a successful student who was able to muster up the voluntary time to get that answer. But it is definitely one that I also have, and I will. You've given me motivation to renew trying to find the right student to be able to do this, or maybe just employing the SAL to be able to do that for us.
You're muted, Roy.
Do you think, Kris, that the issue of lawns and mowing and all of that stuff, runoff of fertilizer, I'm not sure how much is used, might be misconstrued for purely agricultural runoff within the basin?
Meaning that it's I'm not sure if I'm following what you mean by misconstrued for purely agricultural runoff, meaning that the lawns are contributing equally or whatnot?
Equally, and might be and the runoff, whatever is causing impairment might be from lawns, might be misconstrued as the source being agriculture, purely agricultural.
Well, I don't know that for sure, because I think there's a lot to have to do with like soil erosion and what's moving absorbed to the soil versus what's just moving off in stormwater. But what we do know in the basin, that acre for acre, urban areas contribute more phosphorus than agricultural areas in the basin. So your point is well made. We just have only 6% urban area in the Lake Champlain watershed versus what is it? I forget what the percent is for agriculture. It's a much larger area that is agricultural than urban. And as such, agriculture is having more of an impact than urban. But yes, the lawns are probably one of the players. We do know from that survey that not very many people get soil tests before fertilizing, and that is supposed to happen. And so that's something that, and from the outreach perspective, that we need to educate, that people should be getting a soil test to know what their nutrient levels are like before they throw fertilizer on, and timing of that as well, so that it doesn't just run back right off into the waterways.
I think maybe time for one more question. So I'll throw a little optimism, maybe. I hope. This is a plea for optimism, Asim. Are there any model scenarios where an increased growing season might result in increased extraction of nutrients from the watershed? In other words, same amount of nutrient amendment on the growing area, longer production season. Is there a net positive possibly?
Yes, this is a great question. I think the kind of work that we've been doing with Eric Roy's team in terms of like making sure that the nutrients stay on the field where they are, and making sure that the fertilizers are not imported into the watershed. So, and all the best management practices are implemented by not only the farmers, but also urban residents, as well as in the forest best management practices. Under those scenarios, as well as plus, we need to figure out some aeration technologies. Actually, in the Lake Carmel project with a DEC grant, we are working on testing those kind of geoengineering technologies where we basically address the hypoxia conditions and lack of oxygen in these shallow bays by artificially injecting oxygen into the bottom layers of the lake. So those kind of technologies, plus, both internal interventions plus external interventions might lead to basically quick removal of these eutrophic regimes, and bring us back to the mesotrophic systems, or avoid the worst case scenarios under the climate change. But I mean, those are costly interventions, and the question is like whether we can afford those costs across all these sectors. I think that's the question that we're trying to understand, working with the stakeholders.
Thanks, Kris. Looks like you've got a.
Can I just ask a question on a totally different frame to Asim, which is, you talked about the need for anticipatory governance, and all I can think about, you're looking at these areas where there's water scarcity, and I'm thinking about places where there's water, plenty of water, like here, and should we be doing something here or in other places where there is plenty of water to have anticipatory governance for when those other places are going to come looking to us for water? Should we be having some kind of an action now to make a plan for when that happens?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a $1 million question, because like historically, when we look at the human civilization or under the UN Habitat Program, have done these kind of like studies about the global scale migration that would happen with the climate change, because not only because of the sea level rise, but also because of the changes in the distribution of water. I think that it is expected that as the sea level rises by the end of this century, maybe even by the end of the 22nd century, the people, 70% of the global population lives in the coastal areas. They're going to move inland. The salt water has already started to move inside the rivers, like in the Indus Basin, in the Mekong Basin. We see, like these are the tidal systems in the Mekong, where the salt water is already going into the cities. So I think that the people have started to migrate uplands. And I think the places like Vermont, which are, like a little bit away from the ocean, but we are not that far away, because St. Lawrence River might be flooded by the salt water. So I think like it's a question of like, how do we anticipate the migration of the human populations across different areas, because they're going to follow the water. I think so. Vermont is in a good shape from that perspective, but again, whether that water would be clean or whether it would have the water quality that we would be able to utilize that as a fresh water, that is still a big question that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it just seems like it would be smart of us to be proactive about that process, so that at least it's kind of known and we aren't just reacting upon it happening.
Absolutely. I mean, the Syrian crisis probably have opened the eyes of many people in the, because the Syria crisis, you can see the papers in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. It was induced by climate change-induced droughts, and there were 3 droughts that happened between 1990 and 2008 versus 1 drought in the entire 20th century in the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. So the 3 droughts plus the poor governance in Syrian system led to about refugees of like 5 million Syrians. Actually, 1 million refugees are here in Jordan, where I'm right now, and about 2 million are in Turkey, and 2 million are in Europe, 1 million in Germany. And you know, like, so that is an example of how these refugees, when they move, can create political crisis, like the elections of Marine Le Pen, almost near election, or these kind of neo-Nazi movements. So I think like we need to be really anticipating the risks and acting now. And so that's really, really important issue that you have raised.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. I think we should wrap it up. Scott, with the last minute zinger here about the surface water bill, H466, looking to measure and quantify withdrawals for irrigation in agriculture. We'll just let that one quietly land in the chat. Want to thank everybody. Just a reminder, next Celsius Society seminar is June 9th from 2 to 3 p.m. The focus is human behavior. Looking forward to that, and I appreciate everybody making time today, and have a wonderful day.
Cool.
Thank you again, everybody.